Okay, now we are recording. Calling out people who are here. If you're online, send me the words as usual. Abigail is here. Not here. Andrea here. Mullins is not here. Not here. Cooper, not here. Hunter is here. Crowder is here. Leah is not here. Not here. Kennedy is not here. Larissa's not here. Madeline's not here. Hughes is not here. Galloway is. Cook is here. Durgan is not here. Tate is not here. Burton is not here. Kinder is not here. Jones is not here. Canterbury is here. Hobson is not here, and Fisher is not here. So again, those are the people who are physically here. I know there's some people online. Just send me the words. Speaking of which, the first word will be extra credit because I haven't ate yet. So coffee is the first word. And I mean, they're all extra credit for you guys in person, but for you online, that was the word before we started. But now we've started because it's 8 o'clock. So I'll just do some announcements and reminders while we wait for 8:01. Maybe some people straggle in. So the exam's due tonight. Just advice from have like a camera, have your phone ready, right? So just in case something goes wrong, you can take a video or take pictures because stuff happens. Apparently last night, a couple of people tried to take the exam and WVSU online was down, and that could happen. So it'd be good for you to have proof of that. You know, like take a picture of it. If you're taking a picture of your screen, make sure it shows the date and the time on there, all that stuff. Any questions about due tonight? All right, for independent work, I'm sure you guys saw that. Well, no, hopefully you saw the announcement. You need to make sure you use your sources. Make sure everything's included. Like every has to be backed up by. If you have more than one source, please make sure you indicate which information came from which source. So according to CDC.com, blah. Yet according to NationalGeographic.com, I need to know it. And from now on, need anything because it's taken me, and I know it stinks with the and it blows my mind, and I pay attention. Someone could have a really poor grade on the yet they're writing these papers and they are not even accounted for in this. How did you know that? You seem to be some sort of biology expert, so please do that. What else? I guess that's it. Does anybody have any questions about anything? Then, so we're going back in. I need to. I don't want to say rush to go quickly to make up for a little time. I guess the first official word for attendance, that one up there, curves. Curves is the first official word for attendance. Let's see here. Laptop and it's doing wonky things. Anyway. Go. So this is the last concept we actually had a full conversation about survivorship curves, and the point is like, all right, let me back it up one step too. Prior to that, we were talking about survivorship tables, right? Of your likelihood for humans anyway. Obviously, you can do this for any species for their whole lifespan, but this is a survivorship table, a life table for humans, right? So your chances of reaching the next 10 years of your life are right here, right? So the chance to the age 10 is about 99.2% chance. The chances of getting from making it from 50 to 60 is about 94%. You can read that, right? So related to that are these survivorship curves, except when you're doing a survivorship curve, yes, you're kind of graphing what I just showed you. And like I mentioned earlier, now instead of using for the graph on the x-axis, you don't have actual years, right? So if you remember the table I just showed you for humans, 100 did happen to be the highest for years. But in this case, we're looking at percentages of lifespan, right? So we know that, for example, a squirrel's not living to be 100. Neither is an oyster. So this is the percent of the lifespan. And what this shows, and this is what you need to know for the exam, you need to know the difference between a type 1, type 2, and type 3 survivorship curve. That's what you're going to. And the question's most likely giving you some hypothetical situation. This thing is, then you have to recognize it as type 2 or type 3. For example, a human or anything, the chances of dying when you're young are very low. Fairly slow. And towards the end, like once you get closer towards life expectancy, you really drop. That's type 1. Type 3, which is the opposite of making it. That's what that sharp decline means. But then 50% of the life, it then starts to slowly dip down. Meaning for type 3, they don't make it. But the few who do make it usually live a pretty good, but relatively long, right? And, a type 2 species, it's not going to be, there's no chance of dying, or excuse me, the chances don't increase or decrease depending on the age, much chance of dying life. So again, you need to know the difference between type 1 and type. I'm not going to give you an example. I'm not going to say is a squirrel a 2 type 3. I might say something like the oak trees on WVSU's campus all drop acorns. Each one of those baby tree. Most of those baby trees, most of those acorns sprout into grown trees. Most of them are going to die or rot away or be eaten by a squirrel. Type of survivorship curve is that, and that would be a type 3, right? And most of them don't make it, but for those that do, the chance of survival will be high. So any questions about this so far? We'll come back and talk a little bit more about this. Okay. So again, visually, here it is in writing. The type 1 survivorship produce few offspring. I didn't mention that, so that's new information. Type 1 typically produce few offspring, relatively few. So again, using humans as an example, even if you're the mom and produce 8 babies at once, even that's not a lot of offspring considering how many, again, I'll just use the oak trees as an example, because each one of those little acorns is, it's basically a baby. So they're producing a lot more, right? So type 1 produces relatively few offspring. They also give relatively good care to their offspring. And again, using humans as an example, I'm sure you've all either know or seen somebody on the news who did not give good care to their offspring, but generally speaking, type 1 gives relatively good care to their offspring. For example, again, humans, generally speaking, take care of their babies, right? They feed them, they bathe them, they give them a place to live. Like, again, using acorns as an example, that's just a small little seed. The tree drops them, and just drops all their seeds and says, all right, let's hope some of them catch. Let's hope some of them sprout and become new trees, right? They don't really provide much care. The most care into that seed. So, to maturity. That's type 1. Type 3, again, like we saw previously, this is just in writing. It's the opposite of type 1. There's low survivorship, followed by a period when survivorship is high for the few who have lived for to a certain. I would ask you, Dad, where we have produced few offspring here. That's this thing, but right here it should say produce many offspring, right? 3 produces a lot of offspring. It gives relatively horrible care, right? It gives less because again, type 3 is the opposite of type. And then again, type 2 is the intermediate, is constant throughout the entire lifespan. So there's no chance, there's not depending on your age. So any questions about type or type 3? All right. For attendance will be history. So let's talk history. What is a life history? I'm not sure. Yeah. I'm not sure. It's a good question. So the question was, what time does it closed today. It should be a time, but I don't want to say that because God forbid somebody thinks that and there was some glitch and it closed at 11:50, and then someone, I went at 11:59 and it wasn't open. So if you go to it, if you go to the exam, it'll tell you what time it closes. So great question. And again, it should be 11:59, but I don't want to go on record saying that because things get messed up, especially this semester. So anyway, what is a life history? I'm probably not going to ask you that. I might, but probably won't ask you for the definition. It's definitely going to use later in this chapter, and I think the next chapter too. So it's important. Life history have traits that set the schedule of reproduction and survival. So if you were talking about the history, you would say, oh yeah, the average life of a human is 7 years old, right? So we're talking about what time they die, or not time, what age they die. But starts having children at this age and have only one at a time. Yeah. How often do they reproduce? How old are they first reproduce? When did they start producing? How many when they reproduce? Things. That's a life history. Survivorship is an important feature of its life history. And this key life history traits include, not that I'm not going to ask you the key life history traits. That is definitely not the question. I shouldn't say definitely. I should never, ever, mostly not. As I was kind of mentioning when we talked about that first bullet point, I mentioned some of these. The age at first reproduction, like humans aren't physically able to, generally speaking, have children until puberty, right? And that's only physically. And socially and culturally, we don't do it until later. The frequency of reproduction, right? So, again, using humans as an example, 9 months is a gestation period, right? So even that's pushing it too. It's usually longer than that, but to say 9 months, about that. The number of offspring, again, generally humans usually have one. Sometimes there's two. Every once in a while there's three. Even fewer times there's four, so on and so forth. And the amount of parental care given. So all these things we mentioned earlier, those are life history traits. So any questions about what life history traits are? As you already know from the previous chapter, productive success is evolutionary success. So it's a combination of life history that represents the trade-offs and the balances the demands of reproduction and survival. I wish we had more time to get into this. If you were biology majors, this would be like a whole chapter or a whole course, a whole chapter and a whole different course. But there's a lot that goes into that. Like there's advantages to being a type 1 where you put effort into your offspring, your few offsprings, right? So likely to make it. But they're putting just a little bit of effort into your offspring, knowing that if you make a ton of them, eventually some of them are probably going to make it, right? So those are trade-offs, evolutionary trade-offs. And because selective pressures are very diverse. So there you go. This side. All right. Speaking of which, we have more terms that you need to know. And one of them is called an opportunity life history. So if we're talking about the different type of life histories, right? So this whole idea of survivorship curves, type 1, type 2, and type 3, closely related, but different. There are different life history traits. This is the first one that you need to know, opportunistic life history. They take advantage of favorable conditions, and they exhibit a type 3. And what I mean by that, taking immediate advantage of favorable conditions, is that right there, dandelion, you'll see them all. Like one day you look out of your yard and they're not there. Literally the next day there's a bunch of them. That's because that's what they've evolved to do. Once the conditions are the way they to turn into blow away all the seeds, that's what each one of those is. Once conditions are good, that's what they do. They do it quick, right? And again, type 3 survivor. And remember, from type 3 survivorship, they have a lot of offspring that are relatively not. And this dandelion is a great example of that. Because again, each one of these little white things, right? So that thing's just making a ton of ring, putting them out into the wind with the hope that some of them make it. So any questions about what an opportunistic life history? For the exam, I'm probably not going to ask opportunistic life history. I'm probably going to give you some hypothetical example, and you should recognize that life history. The opposite of that, the other one, is called, so this is just, again, basically the opposite. Sexual maturity slowly. And even though I didn't mention it previously when we were talking about opportunistic life history, because remember, everything's pretty much the opposite here. Equilibrial life history, which is on the screen right now, they produce very few or relatively few well cared for offspring. Again, opposite of what we just talked about. They're typically larger bodied and long lived. There are definitely some exceptions to those rules. They typically exhibit a type 1 SNP, again, opposite of the opportunistic life. So once again, exam, you need to know this. And once again, most likely, I'm not going to ask you, what are the, can you identify an opportunistic life? Most likely, I'll describe some situation, and you need to opportunistic. That. And speaking of which, I haven't reiterated this in a while. If you get a question like that, real life history, nonsense, as there have been. If you choose one that's at least one of the and one of, you'll at least get partial credit. And if you choose the wall, you'll get 0 credit. So that's still the case. That was the case with the last exam, and it's the case with the exam that way. This rewards people who are studying, but they at least know the ballpark. It's like, oh, well, it should be some of these. The rest of those make no sense to this question. So consider that. Anyway, when you're studying, this is a table that's not from your textbook, so it wouldn't hurt to PowerPoint. This really helps you compare and contrast opportunistic versus equilibrium. So any questions about that? All right. Let's talk about population growth models. As we mentioned earlier, because again, this is all about population, right? So how populations change over time and the things that cause them to change, right? That's the big picture of this whole chapter. And let's focus back in on population size. Population size does fluctuate, which is interesting. When we're having these conversations, in my opinion, you should stop thinking about humans, because for humans, so far, our human population size doesn't really fluctuate much, right? It did at first. It kind of went slow, and we'll talk about this later in this chapter, but then it skyrocketed, and it's still currently skyrocketing, right? It's not really fluctuating, it's increasing. But generally in nature, most population sizes do fluctuate. As you might imagine, this is pretty common sense stuff here, but what causes population size to fluctuate? We have these models that investigate how the population size may change about it, and how many deer are allowed to be killed this year, right? These are the kind of things you need to know, right? What's causing this population size to fluctuate, and then kind of adjust your numbers for that. All right, so for the exam, before we get into this, what you're going to do is the difference between a couple of things, right? You need to know the difference between exponential growth and logistic growth, which we'll talk about. And again, just like the last ones we talked about, I'm most likely not going to ask you the definition. I will most likely describe a hypothetical situation, and then you determine if it's exponential or logistic. So here we go. Exponential population growth. This is the expansion in an ideal, and I should put quotes, even though the definition doesn't put quotes, unlimited environment. There is no such thing as a truly unlimited environment. Everything is finite. But, if I put a bacteria on a fresh, one bacterium on a fresh loaf of bread, to that thing, that's relatively an unlimited environment, right? It's all by itself. It's got plenty to eat, more than it could digest in its lifetime. So in that sense, you could say it's unlimited, but there are no truly unlimited environments. But for the sake of this conversation, we're going to call it unlimited. Anyway, in this case, in this situation, the population of each new generation is calculated by multiplying the current population by a constant factor that represents the birth rate minus the death rate, which is just a really fancy way. You can figure out the next generation size by multiplying it by the reproduction rate, right? So if the human's reproduction rate, and you could look it up, it's somewhere between 1 and 2, meaning, if the population size was, I don't know, 8 billion, and then after a generation, you would multiply that by whatever the growth rate is, 1.2, right? And that should tell you what the population size will be after one generation. The accelerating growth produces a J-shaped curve. Now that's important for the exam. It's not really important. Like, this information is not any more important than anything else I'm about to tell you. But for the exam, that will almost be almost definitely be on the exam. So when I'm asking you questions, again, giving you this hypothetical situation, and you need to determine if it's exponential or if it's logistic, that's one of the things I'm going to use to describe it, is the shape of the curve. So if it has a J-shaped curve, that is an exponential growth. And I'll show you a picture on an upcoming slide. So for now, just keep that in the back of your mind. That J-shaped curve obviously shows you how rapid the population is growing. So if you have if you have one that looks like this, I hate those stupid lines. I hate this thing so much. Versus a graph that looks like this, like that. Forget those lines coming off to the sides. If I were to ask you, and this might be a good test question too, if I were to give you those two graphs and say, which population is growing quicker, population A or population B? I try to imagine too that they all started at the same point and they all ended at the same point. But which one's growing faster, population A or B? And let me help you because it's hard to see. Population A has the sharper slope, and population B has the less sharp slope. So which one's growing faster? Nobody? Are you just shy? This isn't hard. It's a graph. One of them's going, another one's going. What is it? A, yes. A is the correct answer. Obviously, the population just skyrocketing, and you can see B is taking its time to get up to that same number. So yes, A is growing quicker. Know that for the exam. I'm hoping you guys are just too shy to answer because that was a really easy answer. Of course, it looked, so maybe that was the problem. But anyway, some common exponential growth is common in certain situations following a disturbance, which we'll talk about later, official definition of a disturbance. But for now, let's just say a disturbance is something that, disturbs the. Some of those include, you don't need to write any of these down. These are just examples. And again, we're going to talk about disturbances later. But if there's a fire, right, that wipes out a lot of the things that are living, then the few things that survived have a unlimited environment, so they can take all the resources, and the population just for any of these things, right? If any of these things happen and a bunch of things die, that are left have a, again, quote, unlimited environment. Anyway, any questions about exponential population growth? There's the graph, right? That J curve. And again, if I were to draw, let's say, all right, once again, you can see that one looks like garbage, but imagine they were both ended at the same spot. You would say population A grew quicker than population B, right? Because look, again, assuming it got to the same point, let's call that 450, right? This population got to 450 at around 12 months. This population got to 450 around 6 months. Anyway, if there's no questions about exponential population growth model, let's talk about logistic. Actually, we'll back it up one more time. And the next word for attendance will be rabbit. Anyway, logistic growth pattern. Kind of the opposite, right? Because there's only one or two. Most environments are not unlimited. As a matter of fact, when you really think about it, nothing is unlimited. Nothing's finite. So there are no truly unlimited environments. But even though loose definition, even then, most environments are not even that kind of unlimited, because there are something called limiting factors. You definitely need to know what these are. I might ask you It's definitely a word I'm going to use. Limiting factors are environment that restrict population growth and control the number of individuals that can occupy growth. A limiting factor is the thing that's keeping it from growing as fast as it could, right? Maybe there's not enough food. Maybe there's not enough water. Maybe there's hide from predators. Not enough, or maybe anything that something needs to survive and reproduce. If it keeps it from doing that, that's what we definitely need to understand is carrying capacity. That is the particular environment can sustain. Let me write this here. Maximum population size. However many squirrels are WVSU's campus right now, that's probably close to carrying capacity. It probably pops up and down. It goes above it sometimes, dips below it a few times. I don't know what the carrying capacity is here for squirrels. Whatever it is, probably let's say WVSU's campus only hold 1,000 squirrels. That's probably really high. It's an easy number to deal with, right? That's what that means. That means that's how many squirrels that WVSU's campus can take care of. That is what carrying capacity is. So finally, we get to this, the concept we're trying to talk about here, which is logistic growth as opposed to exponential. This is when the growth rate decreases as the population size carrying capacity. So in other words, in a sense of logistic growth is the thing that comes after exponential, because it all starts off with that J-shaped curve, right? It's exploding and it's exploding. Then, if this is, let me try to draw this a little bit better. Oh, I hate this computer so much with those little lines. If that's the graph, and this is, let's call this, that's the carrying capacity, right? Whatever number that is, that's as high as the population can get, right? So then the population starts declining until it hits, generally speaking, it's not growing or decreasing. It just kind of, meaning the growth rate is zero. So any questions about concept of carrying logistic growth and how they are we'll talk about it a little bit more, but see, there we go. There's a better graph like I was trying to draw, right? So, if I only drew this portion of the graph, to the left of it, this on the exponential growth, right? That's your J-shaped curve. But then again, like I said, once that population starts hitting carrying capacity, kind of evens out, right? And then once you take the whole thing, this whole thing is called logistic growth. And I love this picture. This picture is not from your, this graph, excuse me. This graph is not from your textbook. It's from the old textbook. What I like about it is it's just a model, right? So these, the actual data that was taken. This isn't hypothetical. This is a real study that was done, and that was the actual population size of those little dots. So you can see that the little dots very rarely actually fit exactly on the model. But you can see a basic trend of going up, and then you can see when it hits the carrying capacity, like I said, it goes up, it goes down, but generally speaking, it's right there. So that's another thing to keep in mind. These are just models. They're not exact, but it is what it is. We do the best we can. So any questions about that side? Again, just to remind you, that's just an example. I'm not going to ask you anything about breeding male fur seals. If I did, I would give you this picture and I would say something like, what year was the population size? I don't know, 10,000. When did it first hit 10,000? And I would look here and say, oh, okay, well. So nothing hard, nothing to memorize is my point. All right, the next slide I'm going to show you compares logistic growth with exponential growth. So now that we're done talking about, we can kind of consider them together. And as I mentioned earlier, I reiterate this point again, idea is the population. No natural population fits either one of them, which is why I like that previous slide, those dots. Right? Those dots that show the actual population, none of them were on the line, but they were close. And again, exponential growth versus logistic growth. I should point this out. This is because this is a stupid picture in a way. Carrying capacity that it's showing right there, that is the seal's carrying capacity. That is not this rabbit's carrying capacity. if that was the rabbit's carrying capacity, then it would do exactly what the seal did, which is leave exponential growth and go into logistic growth, just to be clear. Anyway, any questions about the differences between exponential growth and logistic growth? All right. So again, there's factors that control this, right? There's things that control the population size, how quickly the population size will grow or decline for that matter. And there's different types of factors. So let's talk about them. The first one you need to know is a density dependent factor. And again, for the exam, most likely, I will not ask you for the definition. I give you some situation, and you need to recognize it as a density dependent factor. So let's talk about what it is. This limiting factors, it's when we have limiting factors whose intensity is related to the population density. Obviously, they can limit the growth of the natural population. Get rid of that bullet point because that's what we're talking about. All factors, the growth in natural. So that shouldn't be there. That's a mistake. Implies that the other one cannot do that. So anyway, yes, again, whose intensity is related to the population density. So humans is an example of it. I'll use it only because we're familiar. COVID-19 have is a good example because the closer humans are together, the more you are to spread those diseases, right? And the farther apart you are, the less likely, right? Good example. Another good example of a density dependent factor is something called intra-specific competition. Understand? And for the exam, same species for limited reasons, like in that picture. Intra-specific competition. Those two wolves are fighting a carcass. Now in your brain, and we're going to talk about this later, but picture some nature show about Africa. See this lion who just took down a gazelle, and the lion's eating, but then there's also picking at it, and the hyenas get a part of it. That would be interspecific, right? That's a competition between different species. But if it's between the same, anyway, we're not done talking about density dependent factors. Density dependent factors can lower birth rates or increase death rates. I'll give you an example of that later. So again, having individuals in the same area can slow down population. Two things, which makes sense: lower birth rate or increase death rate. And actually, now that I think about it, could be said for density independent. Let me just put it next to this because while this doesn't necessarily make it different from density independent factors. Well, it's not, again, you don't need to know these examples. There's nothing to memorize here because I'm going to give you a hypothetical. Here are some examples. Accumulation of toxic waste products. So do you guys remember that submarine Titanic and got lost? Well, before we knew it imploded, right? There was not starvation, lack and or CO2, right? It was actually poisonous. If you have too much of it, it can kill you. So that would be a great example of accumulation of toxic waste products. Disease, right? Again, like I said earlier, the closer things are, the more likely to spread that disease. Limited food, right? And again, that's different for humans because we go to the border stuff. WVSU's campus, they don't, if they have limited food, it matters how many. There's 1,000 squirrels on this campus or 100 squirrels on this campus. That's going to make it comes to the food supply. There's only so many oak trees that provides their acorns, right? So that would be a difference. Same thing with water, right? The more you have drinking out of the same water resource, the less water there is. Using WVSU's squirrels as an example. There's only so many on this campus. So if the population density of squirrels, there's fewer places to hide. Therefore, they're probably going to reproduce less because they only reproduce when they have a good nest. Also, there's fewer places to hide when a predator is trying to kill them. So a lot of them are going to get. So again, you need to understand what a density factor is. And if it's anything that has to do with the how closely the That would be density dependent. Try to go through this quickly. So here on the left, we have the mean number of offspring per female, and on the y-axis, and on the x-axis we have the density of females. So meaning, let me see here. Of course, they don't tell us what the density exactly is, but let's call that 10 birds per square kilometer, right? So at 10 birds per square kilometer, you can see these birds are having 4 to 5 babies each, or they're laying 5 of them, right? Meanwhile, when there's 70 birds per kilometer, these birds are generally only having, laying 1 egg. Does that make sense? It's because they're in places to build their nests, fewer places to hide, that they have fewer offspring. Of course, that on the left is what is lowering birth rate. And on the right is an example of something that is the death rate, right? So here we have these kelp perch, which is different, it's a particular type of fish to hide in kelp, which is like big underwater plants. They're not actually plants, but they look like plants. Anyway, that's where they hide. So obviously the more, as you can see on this x-axis, the fewer places they have to hide, therefore there's more predators eating them because they're running out of places to hide. Anyway, those are both examples. I'm not going to ask you any questions about those birds or those fish. Anyway, are there any questions about it? Okay, and those pictures are not from your textbook. So if you want to study those pictures for some reason, they're only on the PowerPoint. Let's say the next word, bird. Since we're just finished talking about it, bird. So that was density dependent. And weather or climate, and disturbances such as fall. How dense their population is, right? So for example, if you drop a bomb that can destroy 5 square miles, it doesn't matter. It's killing everything within the 5 square miles, right? So that would be a density independent factor. Now, don't get me wrong. Obviously, if you had more people you could. But the devastation of that blast isn't going to change depending on how many more people you have there, right? It's not like if you add more people to the blast zone that the bomb's going to become stronger. And again, like the examples that are on the board, if there's a huge blizzard next year, like the blizzard like no one's ever seen, and we start getting North Pole weather next winter, that's going to kill all the squirrels on campus, right? Whether there's a bunch of them, or very few of them, it doesn't matter. It's going to kill everything. Anyway, any questions so far about density independent factors? Ooh, that slide does not belong there. That's something else. We'll talk about that later. In the long term, populations, so this is also should not be here. So that's it for density independent factors. Does anybody have any questions, once again, about density independent factors? Your textbook said after that. So we're done talking about density dependent. We're done talking about density independent. But then your book points out in the long term that populations are actually regulated by complex interactions of both, right? So we talk about this thing, we talk about that thing, but in reality, they're both happening. Just like with the whole exponential versus logistic growth thing, right? Exponential growth, everything starts off at that, right? And then eventually it's going to hit logistic growth. So things are related. Said those were just models, right? So nothing was always on the exact model. Same here, right? This isn't exactly this or that. It's usually both. Which brings us to something called a population cycle. And the only one we even talk about is this one, and you need to know it for the exam, a boom and bust cycle. You need to know what a boom and bust cycle is. So again, we're talking about population growth, kind of going back to that idea about, so first we talked about exponential, then we talked about statistic. And in my opinion, this kind of belongs after that conversation. Maybe I should rearrange this PowerPoint. Because not only can you have the exponential, and not only can you have the logistic, but you can have the boom and bust where literally the population will skyrocket like it's exponential, but then it drops. and then it skyrockets like it's exponential, and then it drops. And you don't need to know what it's caused by, but just so you know, it is caused by a winter food shortages from overgrazing. It's caused by predator-prey interactions. It's combined by the combination of the two. Basically, what I'm about to do is give you an example of a boom and bust cycle, which is talking about hares and lynx. So here we go. Let's talk about it very quickly. So there you go. There you can see that's not that's not logistic growth. That's not exponential growth, right? It goes up and it comes down, goes up, comes down. And you can see, for example, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but you can see how the snowshoe hare population increases rapidly right here, right? That looks like a exponential growth. It just crashes, right? And why does it crash? Well, maybe it had a shortage of food. Anyway, then they all die off again. Not all of them, but most of them. So now all of a sudden there's a relatively high amount of food again, right? That density dependent factor is better. So the population increases again. It skyrockets. But then once again, it hits it and then drops. Anyway, point being, well, exponential growth, it's not logistic growth. If it's going up and coming right back down, that is boom and bust. And I do like this example because those two are dependent on each other. So again, you can see how right here, when the population exploded for the snowshoe hare, it also did the same for the lynx because they eat the snowshoe hare. And then again, once the population of the hare crashed, so did the lynx because, again, the lynx eat the hare. So any questions about that example? All right. If you download the PowerPoint, you can watch this little animation about population ecology. Talk about applications of population ecology. Natural ecosystems have been converted to those that produce goods and services for our benefit. Another way of saying that is humans have turned natural ecosystems into artificial ecosystems that help us. You know, farm, for example, especially in the Midwest. You had this area that was, or like Iowa, right? So probably a prairie, a lot of natural grasses, and then humans took that and said, no, we don't need all these different all these different species. We're just trying to grow corn, for example, right? So then what they want to do is increase the population of the organisms they wish to harvest, right? So they're planting corn. They decrease the population of pests, right? So they don't want the insects that the corn. They don't want other plants growing there, like weeds, to take away the nutrients from the corn. But also, in some cases, we want to save the populations of organisms that are threatened with extinction. So that's not going to be a test question. Those concepts will come up, but that won't be a test question. That's the whole thing was basically just an introduction to talk about these 5 bullet points. We're going to talk about the conservation of endangered species. We'll talk about sustainable resource management. We'll talk about invasive species. We'll talk about biological control of pests, and then finally integrated pest management. So here we go. This is just an example. Oh, there's a video. I found the video. I made questions for it. It's on the extra credit video sheet, but there's a video that's out there that does a great job showing what we're about to talk about. And this is just an example, right? So everything I'm about to tell you, just understand this is an example. I'm not going to ask you any specific questions about it. There's this woodpecker species that lives in places like North Carolina, down south, fire longleaf pine forest, meaning because they like to drill their nest holes in those pine trees. They won't live anywhere else. They're really picky. It's probably why they're endangered, because they're very specific. What happened was the woodpecker numbers started to decline because they started losing that very specific habitat. They lost it to things like logging, agriculture, right? Also, things like you can see in this video, military exercises, right? There's an army base in North Carolina where they have to watch out for these woodpeckers. But here's where it gets interesting to me, is this part right here. It's the first time I think I'm going to say this. So finally, we're getting into some information here that's not common sense. And this is going to come up a lot throughout the next 2 chapters. Now we're getting into stuff that's counterintuitive, right? Because if I told you, if I took you all right now on a field trip to this forest in North Carolina, and I was like, this is where this endangered species lives, need to protect it. And then there was a fire. Common sense was like, oh, we should put that fire out because this is where these things live, right? So we need to protect their habitat. We need to put that fire out. But it turns out that suppressing fires was actually a thing that was hurting the population. It was actually lowering their numbers. And again, this is why I think this is very important. This is why scientists do these studies, because without this, common sense is not always the right. Putting out a fire would be common sense to me if I were in this situation. Like, there's an endangered species living in these woods. Let's not let it burn down. But in this case, it was not good. Let's talk about it wasn't good. So there'll be no specific questions. Don't study these numbers or anything I'm about to tell you about this woodpecker. But when these woodpeckers were breeding, they would abandon trees or their nests that are in the trees when the vegetation was too thick and high. Specifically, once it got over about feet, they're like, well, this isn't going to work, right? So they would leave their nests, and they would either just not they would just leave their eggs, and the eggs would die too. Why do they require the vegetation to be less than 15 feet tall? Well, they require a clear flight path between trees. They don't like to fly through the bushes. So the critical habitat was protected now with a maintenance program that includes controlled fires. And that's what I'm getting at here, right? That's what textbook's getting at. Once they figured that out, once they figured out not only do they need these trees and they need to live here, they need them to be natural. And in nature, wildfires happen periodically and nothing goes to put them out, right? So because of that, once they figured that out, they started setting fires and controlling them to make sure they didn't spread too far. And then the population started to recover. And again, I love this example because it's not common sense. It goes against common sense. And a lot of this does. And this is why we need scientists. Anyway, there's the woodpecker on the left. You can see on the top, this is what it looks like, or used to look like before, when humans were involved. And then, I don't want to put it that way. Anyway, the top is what it looks like without the burning, and the bottom is what it looks like with the burning. And again, if it were me, and you were to show me those two pictures without any captions, and you're like, which one of those looks healthier? I'm like, oh man, that top looks healthier, right? Common sense tells you plants are good, green. So to me, that up top would look like a healthy system. But in all actuality, the more natural ecosystem is the bottom. And in fact, not only is it healthier, but it was important for that endangered species. So any questions about that? All right, let's talk about sustainable resource management. So again, these are all ways that population ecology is used in the real world. According to logistic growth is that where you have a graph, the population rises and it hits carrying capacity, right? That's logistic growth. According to logistic growth, the fastest growth of a population occurs when the population is at that number that's halfway between 0 and the carrying capacity. So again, if we were talking about WVSU squirrels and the carrying capacity was 1,000, that's just a number I'm right there. That's carrying capacity. Thanks so much. Halfway between there would be 500, right? So for some reason, they were harvesting squirrels to feed you guys in the cafeteria. And I was in charge of how many squirrels they could harvest. I would say, all right, you can only harvest 500. We want the numbers to be about 500. Is that way the population's still growing quickly, but you're still harvesting a lot? If I were to have you harvest any more than 500, that would be good for the people harvesting that first time. More than 500, that's a lot. That's a lot of squirrel meat. Then the population would crash because, you'd start slowing things down because you harvested too many. If I harvest, well, I got more examples. Just move forward. Sorry. Achieved by harvesting population down to this level. However, the logistic model assumes the growth rate and carrying capacity is stable over time. So it's something I haven't mentioned. So it was hard to see with all those stupid lines. Try to picture that graph. And keep in mind, that is a snapshot and fit precisely, but it's also a snapshot in time. As things change, other things change, right? As the conditions in this example, as the conditions in the North Atlantic change, you might for this fish as well. But because things change, number might get. Again, I'll remind you, I'm not going to ask you any questions about this example. But fish are the only hunted at large scale. I know it's weird, but technically fish, you're hunting an animal. So they're very vulnerable to overharvesting. And the example you know what? 2 minutes left. It's a fire. I won't be able to finish this in 2 minutes. So we'll talk about this on Monday. Is 1992. But this time next week, class will be online only. This room will be filled with people doing other stuff. They need the room. So this time next week, Friday, will be online only. Good? All right. Don't forget to send me the words if you're online. And you guys have a good weekend. I'll be doing office hours if you need me.